Hi and welcome to this video tutorial. My name is Velin. This video takes a high-level view of an important question that is often asked in organizational settings, and that is why change? Why are we doing any sort of change? Where's the pressure? What are the drivers, we like to call them? There's no requirement that we have to make those changes, whatever the pressure is we're feeling. But when we're thinking that perhaps we should be, or maybe seriously we must be making some kind of changes or improvements to any aspect of our organizations, why are we doing it? So let's begin by first looking at the environmental pressures, or what we often refer to as external drivers. So these are the things that are outside of the organization that put pressure on the organization in different ways that will often cause it to, at the very least, say, how do we respond or should we respond? What do we need to do to address that organizationally so we can continue to thrive or become better and so on. From a marketing point of view, you hear this all the time. One of the first ones is demography. So demographics, things change, marketplaces change. We always know this. It can change depending on the region we're in. It can depend on years passing. Demographics also have an impact on our employee base, our leadership. Mandate. This may be something that is mandated. This is often legal or governmental, or maybe in the area of social responsibility. Of course, with climate change and so many things going on around sustainability, this is at the very least a social impact pressure. And even if it's not legal or legislated by government, this is something that is generated by public pressure. And so when we look at things that are mandated, these are things that the government tells us or social pressure tells us we must do. We can avoid doing it for a while, but ultimately it is a function of a requirement versus a choice of the organization necessarily to do it. That's mandate. Reputation. Perhaps we want to improve our reputation or repair it. Maybe it's something about our products, our services, processes, governance problems. This has to do with how the overall organization is run from the board on down. Reputation has a lot to do with internal factors as well. So we can think of this as external, but also having an internal element, even though it may often be coming in from the outside. So if customers are very unhappy with the way we're doing things, this will infect our employee base with concerns, to say the least. So reputation is a big one. If our reputation is suffering, we'll need to do things organizationally to fix it. And this is not a simple matter. Often we look at these things and think, well, how do we make these changes? Can't we just fix this or fix that? Until you realize that because organizations are made up of complex systems, being able to lead change through something like that is really important in order to get it done. Ultimately, in this area of reputation, we need to be able to connect the dots between the external reputation and what we need to do internally in order to improve that outside perception, really. The next one is dubbed hyper-competition, or really this is anything to do with competition at all. So hyper-competition really refers to things that are disruptive. So big players moving into a marketplace we might be in, or other things that are perhaps some small organization somewhere, or even a large one has come up with, what we call high velocity innovation. In other words, they've really transformed something that we were doing, and now we have to respond or will disappear. Out of sector competition can happen as well. So you have a competitor that's taking over a product or service area that's not exactly in our area, but maybe they're offering an alternative. So these are all areas that we call hyper competition because they have a huge impact, and it's not just our day-to-day competitors that we normally see. One of the big areas we can see this is large companies like Amazon and Apple getting into the entertainment world. So now we see it as a natural extension, but not that long ago, it was something that it was just nobody saw the connection. All the entertainment companies are either competing with Apple and Amazon not just Netflix, and partnering with them now and trying to find different ways to work because they are also managing distribution. The next one we're looking at is what we call geopolitics. So these are forces that come from the understanding that, of course, even though we operate our organization, whatever we do, in a certain region or a certain area, these things are becoming more and more clearly interdependent. So we realize that what we do in one area of the planet has an effect on another area. That in itself isn't new. Certainly we're dealing with issues in different ways around global warming and climate change. And we can see that there's a connection with things that might get mandated. And right now, I think with the last probably 6 or 7 years, we've seen a lot of this battle between social responsibility and mandate and the realization that there are pressures coming from different parts of the world to up our game. Here in Canada, we think of ourselves as being natural and taking care, but the reality is our policies in many ways are not necessarily as strong in terms of climate change as they are in other parts of the world. The last high-level pressure point or driver is what's sometimes referred to as fashion, but this is really about what is fashionable from a leadership or organization point of view. We have to be careful with these. Sometimes the new things that are cool and trendy that we want to adopt in our organizations seem like fun, or they might seem really interesting, but are they really right for us? So we have to be careful that we don't get drawn into this. And I'm going to put a little question mark here because this is something that you see people. I used to work a lot in consulting, and this is something that consulting firms often, in some ways, often rely on, which is, can we be seen as the kind of fashionable or leading edge avant-garde solution to an organization's problems? It doesn't mean if it's fashionable that it's wrong. It just means we have to be careful that we're not choosing it just because we're all hyped up over something and pulling our organization in one way or another. One thing that's really interesting to observe now in the last little while at this creation of this video, this is 2022, we've seen, because of COVID, the impact on just-in-time inventory management and logistics. It doesn't mean we're going to drop the idea of being just-in-time, but we realize that our global network for logistics is fragile. So this is something where it's not a fashionable thing to have a just-in-time inventory management system or logistics. However, there are some people that are going, whoa, we should stop doing this because of all this fragility. The bottom line is, if we're careful and we don't leap on something just because it seems like everybody's doing it or it's the leading edge thing to do, then it's worthwhile exploring. So these are the high-level external drivers, things that are considered in organizations that happen outside of the organization. Now let's take a look at the internal drivers. The internal drivers or pressures, much like the external ones that we've looked at, remember that these are high level. So when you break these down, you will see that there are a lot of smaller pressures and drivers contained within them. In other videos, we take a closer look at these things in a much more detailed way. So let's begin with growth. Everybody loves growth. We want to grow. Doesn't matter if our organization is private sector, for-profit, or if we're in the not-for-profit sector or an NGO, or if we're government or anything else. We often see growth as kind of built into our DNA. We so often want to see growth. Even government agencies want to see growth in service delivery because there's likely a societal issue that is being addressed by the expansion of delivery, a betterment of society, we hope, those kinds of things. So the internal driver of change we call growth is this interest in being bigger, having a bigger budget, offering more, getting more revenue, whatever it might be. So that driver will put pressure on the organization. And typically with growth comes complexity. The bigger the department, the team, the organization, the more complex it becomes. And then you need to take a look at things like systems, standardization of hiring practices, formalizing all kinds of things that we might have done off the corner of our desk before. All of a sudden we need to lock things down a little bit more because so many more people involved, it will just get really confusing. And so we need to be careful that when we look at how our organization grows, that we don't over mandate rules and kill creativity. So this is the juggling act of complexity, having rules to get things standardized and same so people understand what's going on, and yet not doing it in a way that kills our creative juices, our creative output. So that's growth, and it brings with it a whole host of things to look at. Integration and coordination. In mid and larger size organizations, this is about killing what we often refer to as the silo effect. We want to get rid of that and have great cross-divisional communication, information sharing, openness. Sounds great, right? Except it has difficulties when we try to implement something like this because people like to protect their areas. So the silo effect is the thing that occurs when we have different areas only talking to themselves and then not to each other. So we have a lot of down-up communication, but not a lot of sharing between these areas. So integration and coordination is about that, getting information and sharing it, knowledge sharing. When that pressure starts to come up because people can't do their job, that's when you get those drivers showing up. Power and politics. Discussion of organizational life would not be complete without bringing this up. So power, whoever holds power in the organization, will be able to put pressure to fulfill their own agenda in some way. We see this all the time. Politics, this is about the undercurrent and relationships that exist within the organization that have nothing to do really with the organizational chart, which is that formal organization. So stakeholder interests, this is about anybody who has a stake or benefits from the outcome of the organization in any way. This can be everything from customers to ownership to politicians, local communities, depending on what the organization does. So all of this stuff has an influence on what the organization does to operate. All of this influence is, when you break it all down, these are all different drivers that may want to see things occur a certain way and put pressure on the organization to respond. When we look at having a new senior leader, a new chief executive, or anybody who's new in the senior leadership level, this can often have substantial effects on the organization, and they will want to put their mark on their area. If they're the CEO, it'll be the whole organization, or perhaps a part of it that they have a certain kinship with, a certain feeling about. If you're the CFO, you're going to be definitely putting your mark on the financial operations of the company. If you're the chief development officer, maybe your role is about creating organizational partnerships or industry partnerships or alternative funding opportunities, whatever that might be. So it brings in new energy into the organization, and hopefully it's beneficial. And for sure, there's going to be some top-down driving of change within the organization. And lastly, we have corporate identity. And this one is not simply a marketing positioning thing. This may actually go deep into the organization's original purpose and goals. Ultimately, there will be a corporate branding element to this, but it can come out in a lot of different ways. But we're talking overall is a change in direction. So when you have changes in direction, doesn't matter how big or small the organization is, there will be ripple effects that will create changes or put pressure on the organization to create the changes to help the organization get to its new direction. So this is the high-level view of the internal organizational change drivers. Knowing all of these forces that are at play that trigger change within the organization, why is it that we don't make the changes that we feel are good or right for the organization? Doesn't matter what our agenda is, whether it's an external driver or an internal driver. What happens? Well, we encounter forms of what we call organizational resistance. Now, we get into resistance in a much deeper way in another module, but looking at the high-level drivers, let's look at the high level of organization resistance. The first is structural inertia. This is a broad term that points to the resistance or reluctance of the existing structure. So the way the organization is now doesn't want to give itself up. And there are a lot of reasons for it. If you're in a team or a department and you really like how it works, or maybe you're just used to it, somebody comes along and says, hey, we're going to move things over here and do things over there. We have a natural tendency as human beings to say, no, I feel comfortable here. I don't really want to change it. And doesn't mean everyone feels exactly the same way. Maybe you'll be in that boat that says, thank God we're finally making the change, but we still need to adjust to it. So structural inertia is simply that collection of resistances related to the current organization structure and it's wanting to be the same. Next one we're going to look at is the limited focus of change. Again, we get into this in other modules, but sometimes the changes we want to create don't go far enough, and people can see that it's not really going far enough, so people may reject it out of hand and not see that a small change is actually better than no change. When people want to see really important things occur, this limited focus will work against itself if it doesn't seem to go to the deep root of understanding and changing what matters most. That's one aspect of limited focus of change. Another element of this is that when the specific change is constrained or too limited, never mind the futility of people resisting the idea that this is something that's just not going to work, even if it's implemented. If the focus is too narrow, the hope or the anticipation of a result won't occur because it's just not going far enough. So it may actually cause a backslide, and the resistance will be even stronger the next time a change effort is initiated. Next thing we'll look at is group inertia. This is the same as individual inertia, just in a group. And so what happens in a group, you've probably heard the term groupthink. And what happens in groups is this tendency to want to kind of stick together. There is a bit of that. And so group inertia can simply be that if you're coming in from the outside of that group and saying we're going to make a change here or there, the group has a tendency to say no. It's sort of like a safety in numbers thing. It doesn't mean that the objection or the resistance is wrong. We have to be clear about this. And later on, when we get into resistance, we explore this more deeply. But to understand that group inertia exists, you've probably experienced it many times. It can be as simple as suggesting to friends who've already made a decision on a restaurant they want to go to on a Friday night, and you say, guys, what about going to this other place we haven't been to before? And if you're talking to them as a group, they might all go, no, I don't know. They're all looking at each other. I'm not sure, da-da-da-da-da. This is essentially what we're talking about more in an organizational setting, of course. How do you deal with it? One of the things you do is to spend time with the group or the team and having a conversation that allows people to voice their real opinions. And you may find, as is often the case, that you have some people feel one way, some people feel another. Some people find it valuable to speak to group or team members individually. But what often happens is you speak to one person, you say, please keep it confidential. They talk to other people anyway. So one of the main ways to address groups that are showing inertia is simply having a conversation with them that is open, that takes the time that it needs to let people voice their individual opinions, to have conversations to resolve the concerns, all of that. Too often, though, we try to push things through and not really have the investment there to ensure that the group members are actually stepping forward freely. The next one is threat to expertise. When changes are coming up in an organization, especially if the changes involve process changes, service or product offerings, so literally what we output, when those kinds of fundamental things occur, people can feel threatened that their expertise that they may really appreciate about themselves, or maybe it took a lot of time to learn, and maybe it's even given them a bit of a status within the organization of being an expert in a certain area. If that information or that knowledge is not needed as much anymore or is changing, we can feel threatened because it relates for people to their very position. Maybe they feel that their job is on the line. Maybe they feel that they're becoming out of date, and it sort of taps into that sense of security and stability. Very powerful stuff. Threat to established power relationships. This comes from a similar place as the threat to expertise, because if we have strong relationships in different parts of the organization, and because of the organization changes, maybe there are structural changes where people are moving around. Those relationships have been important to people, and maybe that means that those relationships are going to be cut, at least from a direct operational point of view. Maybe it's going to involve some people leaving the organization so that now the relationships we have are not as many. Maybe we have to start working with new people and we're not as trusting, and it brings up all kinds of things. So threat to established power relationships can be a very, very big form of resistance. And by the way, power does not necessarily mean authority. It may mean our sense of how powerful we feel within the organization. And then the last one is a threat to established resource allocations. This is a lot about budgeting or access to people. It can be a very, very tough thing to handle, because if we're used to having a certain amount of money to work with, a certain staff, access to other resources, and now those things may be threatened, we will, much like our power relationships and our expertise, these are things we feel that we have some ownership over. And when that's being potentially taken away, we do resist. So that is the high-level view of the forces that work against any potential change. The last thing we're going to do is have a look at an example using something called force field analysis, which is another wonderful tool, which we get into in another module in much more detail, that looks at a situation with a group or a team that is getting some pressure on it, external and internal, to become different or better. And again, we're just taking this on a high level. We're also looking at some of the things that are resisting, that keep it in place. So let's have a quick look. A force field analysis is a tool that allows us to take a snapshot of a circumstance. This can be used, in this case, on a team or a department or any situation, and look at its current state. We can also use this to look at a potential change effort. In other words, if we want to put in here, instead of current performance, we put in change project X, we can speculate and work with this tool to see, okay, what are the forces pushing the change forward and what are the forces that might resist it? So this is a great tool. I use it all the time. Sometimes I just use it in my head to figure something out. It's a great tool. And again, like I said, we go into more detail in another module. So the forces for change for this group. Well, there's some new technology that could be internal or external, asking the group to do things perhaps differently or adopt new technology. Maybe the organization is getting better raw materials in for whatever the group is doing. Maybe it's a manufacturing group. And so we have the opportunity to do better. Now, most people would say, hey, great, better raw materials, but that's still an adaptation that needs to take place. Competition from other groups within the organization. Maybe it's an organization that's big enough that has different teams work on different things, and maybe they're competing for resources or they're competing for some kind of recognition, whatever it might be. Supervisor pressures. Maybe the team leader, or more likely a leader that the team reports to, is putting pressure on the group to change something or improve in some way. So they want to go from this current performance, whatever it is, to some desired future state. This would be the goal of where they want to see the team go. But of course, because we're human beings, there are resistances. There are resistances, and in this model, we call them forces for the status quo, keeping things the same. Well, there are group performance norms, and we get into this in other modules again about teams and so on, but group performance norms are about the day-to-day way things are actually carried out, the behaviors, rituals, and so on that the group has adopted both consciously and unconsciously to keep it functioning in their mind well. Those norms are in place, and they can often be quite strong. What we call the way we do things around here, that's often a phrase that's used, and it really describes how the group gets things completed. A fear of change, a good old fear of change, that's fairly broad. But again, what we're probably talking about is some kind of group inertia here. Member complacency. We have to be careful with complacency because that's a label, even though it's used in this example. I prefer to look at it as a way of saying, well, we're seeing what looks like complacency. Let's find out what's really going on. And that's what we need to do. So this, again, is a high level. But if there's complacency, that means that maybe they're having moderate success and they feel like they're doing okay. But be careful about using the word complacency. In my mind, it's sometimes like using the word lazy. That's a powerful label that is too generic and too vague to really mean anything. And the last one, we talked about threat to expertise. This is the same idea, well-learned skills. So let's say the group members or some of them are really skilled at doing certain things that they're awesome at. Now, because of these other forces, that means they have to drop some of those skills and learn something new. Or maybe they're just afraid that they have to stop using certain skills or knowledge that they have. And that, of course, is an inherent resistance. Even if we see that there's a benefit, we almost have to let some things die, which as people, we don't want to do that. We don't want to let go of skills and so on because we like them for the most part, maybe, or we've become so good at them that we have a certain sense of security around them. This brings us to the end of our high-level view of the forces for change, the environmental factors that are external, as well as the forces for change that are internal. Typically, these things don't happen in isolation. So you may have an external force for change or more than one that triggers an internal force for change, which will then trigger internal forces against the change or resistance. And like I said, go into some of the other modules that are on these different topics and we'll explain them in much more detail.